a senior lecturer here in the School of Media and Performing Arts, and then for the other half of the week I run a not-for-profit arts organisation, participatory arts organisation in Coventry called Ludic Rooms. And so I wanted to talk to you today about a specific case study of one of our participatory programmes that we ran called Open Citizens, and talk a little bit about how that project came about. And the purpose of doing that really is to explore and kind of communicate some of our participatory methodologies, specifically this one particular technique, our approach to the use of technology in among those participatory methodologies, and then also the role of play taking part within that as well. So I've been working as artist. I used to always precursor that with digital artist, but I think it's just safer to say artist now, for nearly 20 years. And I'm also have been a Coventry citizen for that same period of time. And about 10 years ago, started this organisation, Ludic Rooms, to cross over this thinking and to try and create an identity around ways of working with technology, with participation and with play. The first 5 to 10 years of Ludic Rooms' existence, we were pretty much exclusively chasing around the country and sometimes internationally, following the commissions that were available. So, and to a lot of practitioners, this will be very recognisable. Working with local authorities, festivals, galleries, museums, schools. Generally speaking, that means going to those places in order to help work on programmes. And also when you're working with technology, what you start to see, and particularly in participatory settings, what you start to see is a lot of similar projects, and we've kind of touched upon some of those models of project today. There's a lot of people asking for apps, a lot of exhibition work that's around developing meaningful interaction with audiences. There's an awful lot of screen-based work or audio-based work, heritage angle stuff that with things like, in the very early days, a lot of stuff around oral histories and communicating heritage. But one of the things that we've really started to find is that we had a slightly different approach or a slightly different mentality to a lot of our competitors. And this is just a few kind of examples of some of the stuff that we do. So the first thing about the way that we work with technology is that we are completely agnostic around the technology that we work with. And technology will never be the starting point of anything that we're doing. We get an awful lot of organisations coming to us saying, hey, we want a big shiny thing. Can you give us one of those big shiny things like you made for that other museum 5 years ago? And we'll say, absolutely not, but you can give us some money to ask people what they actually need. And that's the kind of approach. So firstly, we'll never start with a platform or a product or a technology or an idea as the starting point for a project. So we refer to that and have referred to that for nearly a decade as post-digital practice, in that although we acknowledge the presence of technology and everything we do is fundamentally rooted in the sociocultural phenomenon of the 21st century, our networked and connected society, we are fundamentally more interested in the human than in the technical. And when you use that as your starting point, as the philosophical starting point for your way of working, very, very different things emerge out of the other end, as opposed to standing up in front of people and saying, hi, I'm a digital artist, because then you get less questions about asking to make you apps. So yeah, we've worked all over the country, lots and lots of partnership working, but obviously there's been a reason recently within Coventry to start trying to focus geographically closer to home. And I think it's fair to say that up until about 2 or 3 years ago, we'd done almost no work in Coventry at all, despite having been based here for our entire lives. There was not the capacity or the desire or to be kind of working in this city the same way that we were working in Bristol or London, for example. But we've seen a real groundswell of activity over the last few years, not just because of City of Culture, but also because of these ongoing reshifts within the local authority, some bid writing and strategy writing. And we were engaged around this time in both the development of the cultural strategy and the development of the digital strategy as a kind of key organisation in the region. We're also involved in what happened about a year after both of these reports were released, of the retrospective attempts to try and actually align the digital strategy for the city and the cultural strategy for the city, because no one at the point of writing them had actually thought about trying to think of them as the same thing. One of the things you'll find in Coventry is that we do have some smart infrastructure. We have Appy Park, we have My Permit, so we have a system by which you can tell whether there are parking spaces and try and locate a parking spot on an app. And equally we have big belly bins, these compressing smart bins, waste bins. But the problem with a lot of this infrastructure that's around the city that uses connected or network technologies is it's incredibly top-down. It's oriented towards efficiency within the local authority. So as much as the local authority can tell us that Appy Park is about our convenience of finding a parking space, the reality is that really it's about their convenience of being able to issue parking fines more efficiently or employ less waste management people, for example, not about preventing bins from overflowing. So we very much work within the principles of the playable city movement that's come out of Bristol, the idea that smart infrastructure in cities should be grassroots oriented and come from a real demand from real people and being produced in response to activism, should be developed in response to people wanting to make life better, not just make life more efficient. One of the principles of playable cities is that the adoption of technologies in cities should not be about making things frictionless, because who wants to live in a frictionless city? You know, one of the reasons we live in cities is because of the friction of the people we meet and the things that make us stop and pause, not just being sucked into a vacuum tube around the city as easily as possible. And a lot of our work, coming from an activist perspective, also are rooted in this idea of the role of citizenship. I often say to my students, if you're not trying to make the world better, then go home. You know, it doesn't matter what you're making, but the purpose of that should be about trying to achieve some sort of better world. And so we wanted to have some principles of that. And as a non-for-profit organisation with social aims, we wanted this was becoming almost the most central tenet of everything that we were doing. So moving on to play. What's so important about play? Well, firstly, a lot of people don't like play. Local authorities, governments, businesses don't like play. The Art Academy don't like play either. Zach Cage says that play is a lowly word in the high art establishment. But of course, play is universal. Play is something that absolutely everyone in this room will do in some form, shape, or another, and we can find universality in play. But what play doesn't help with is coming up with great ideas, because play is by definition unpragmatic. Play is something that is non-result oriented. Play is something not done to serve a purpose, but for the purpose of doing it itself. So play for us is somewhat akin to art and the long-standing discussion between the difference between art and design, where games are design, play is art. One being purposeless and or rooted in its own activity, the other one being about a means to an end, about trying to achieve something. So from this, these different kind of directions, this project Open Citizens was born. And in fact, Open Citizens started with a pilot funded by Think Higher in 2016, where we looked at these challenges with one specific group of people, or one specific context, I should say, and that was education. So we started the pilot phase of the Open Citizens project on the basis that we wanted to start small, and that being one of our basic principles of how we work. We knew that we wanted to explore this idea of unpragmatic and or speculative making, but we also know, and this has been alluded to a few times from other presenters as well, that repeatedly making, testing, and repeating the iterative processes of making are really, really important as well. So continue this idea of not relying on technology. We start off working with a group with known materials. Now that will vary from group to group, what we mean by known materials. But often one of the things you find when you say I'm a participatory arts organisation working with technology, the immediate assumption therefore is STEM. The immediate assumption is that we're like Code Club, that what our purpose is about digital skills development. You know, it's about teaching every kid to code. And some of our projects kind of have that kind of thing. We wanted to have a project where we worked around the critical engagement with what it means to be a person living in a society surrounded by technology, not focus on how you actually adopt those technical means. There's millions of other people doing really fantastic work in that. So the first iteration of Open Citizens took place as a result of support from Think Higher, which is one of HEFT's National Network for Collaborative Outreach. It's very much about widening participation within the higher education sector. And what we're interested in was this question about how can a creative or arts-led approach to technology encourage us to be more active citizens. And we took two groups of people. One were GCSE citizenship students who, for the most part, this is students from secondary school in Coventry, specifically targeted because of a low percentage moving on to higher education. And we took them as the experts. And then we partnered them with undergraduate digital media students. Because the perspective being, we did this during the first week of the undergraduate program for digital media. So this was their freshers induction. Because what we did was, we took in a bunch of highfalutin 18-year-olds who thought they were on top of the world, put them in a room with a load of 15-year-olds and showed them how little they knew. And so the citizenship students from Coventry served as the experts in Coventry for the newly arrived group of undergraduate students, although were a couple of years ahead of their creative skills engagement, knew absolutely nothing about the city for the large part. We underwent a kind of procedure where we used these known materials to try and rapidly prototype ideas for things in the city that use technology, smart pieces of infrastructure, and then shared them with decision makers within 6 weeks, using some sort of open manufacturing tools along the way, so using some 3D printing and CNC and laser cutting, but mostly focusing on the affordances of these things, not how they were made, not worrying about the tools that you needed, the technologies that you needed, not worrying about how they were going to be powered or anything like that. Starting on the principle that if you can imagine it, there will be a technology that can achieve it, and instead focusing on the human affordances of that approach. Shortly after we delivered this pilot program, City of Culture opened a bid for Digital Artist in Residence, an international bid which we won. They didn't give us enough money, so we went to the Arts Council and got a little bit more money, and we delivered the second phase of the Open Citizens project. And this time we decided to kind of be a little bit more specific with what we were thinking about for Coventry and the area that we were trying to tackle. This is Coventry, for those of you that don't know, and Coventry is a bit of a strange city when it comes to transport. So Coventry was simultaneously one of the first pedestrianised city centres in Europe. It was birthplace of the safety bicycle, had over 130 bicycle factories at one point, and up until, well, when I first moved to Coventry, was still seen as the Detroit of the UK. And so there was still 2-3 Peugeot factories, 2 or 3 Jaguar factories, the taxi factory, and other car manufacturers with connections through to the city. And yet, despite this, Coventry is not a cycling city like Amsterdam. There's almost no cycling infrastructure in this city. Coventry is not a pedestrian-friendly city in the same way that Venice is. Coventry is also not a motor city in the same way that Los Angeles is, despite the heritage of the motor car being so prevalent in this city. In fact, what we end up with as a result of pieces of infrastructure like the Coventry Ring Road, the massively divisive Coventry Ring Road, is these loads and loads of interstitial spaces, lots of in-betweeny kind of things. And those in-betweeny spaces, like odd bridges that wobble in strange ways, or dark alleyways, or underpasses, kind of represent our whole kind of citizens kind of relationship through to travel around the city more broadly. So we wanted to think about the ways that citizens move around the city. Where do we stay still as well as where do we move? How can we challenge and make visible our own behaviours? And how can we also raise a discussion with people around the ways in which we own and share these public spaces? So then the first thing we had to do was go out and look silly and pose for press photography, whilst we went into a dialogic phase. So the first thing that we did was we spent 3 weeks talking with as many people as possible about the ways that they move around the city. This is the Ludic Rooms team, incidentally, so this is kind of the 4 or 5 of us that were directly engaged with the project. We talked with cyclists, with canal boaters, with Deliveroo cyclists, taxi drivers. We talked with shop mobility service users. And we started to try and identify some of the challenges. Then we also realised that in order to work with lots of different people, we were going to need to condense this form of the Open Citizens programme that we operated that ran over 6 weeks, and we needed to try and find a methodology that would operate within about an hour. So we needed to take some shortcuts. So over the course of this research and development, we developed a new series of ideation cards, playing cards, to help take us the shortcut. And these are rooted in the same post-digital principles that our ways of working. So focused on the place, focusing on not the technology, but what the technology affords of the object, and finally the effect that the individual experiences, that the human experiences as a result. So each individual or each group within one of these workshops is given a set of randomized 3 cards and then asked to try and devise something. And this is simply as a shortcut. Because we knew that we wanted to work with people relatively quickly. It was then play tested at Counterplay Festival in Aarhus in Denmark as part of the European Capital of Culture programme in 2017, this methodology. And we then engaged more than 450 people around the city through partnering with client and delivery groups and venues in order to create these rough prototype models of the different interventions people would like to see in their cities. So once people made these models, we encourage people to work in 3D because when you take it off the page, you start to consider some of the pragmatic notions of making something, whilst at the same time also making, a disco bus stop or or a bin that talks to you. So we worked with more than 450 people to generate ideas, making somewhere in the region of 150 models. We then hosted an exhibition of those models at the CET building in central Coventry and had a series of kind of events that tied in with that. Then off the back of exhibiting those models and all of the discussion that kind of came through that, we then took some of these ideas, we took 4 of the ideas, and we turned them into a reality. So we went away and created a series of different things, which we then installed across the city as part of a week-long takeover, continuing this discussion and this dialogue around the themes of what we were trying to achieve. From the outset, these were temporary projects and were never promising to be anything other than temporary. And so they're as much about the experiential as they are the legacy. All of them came directly from workshop outputs, and the only changes that we made were pragmatic ones. So I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. So we made a networked series of data logging bins that burped and giggled in response to people throwing away their rubbish. We made a pair of electric scooters where the throttle was rewired to go faster the louder you screamed at the scooter. And then we also created a dancing booth called You Can, where anyone could come in, dance with Gloria, our glorious chroma key assistant there. The software then automatically chroma keyed, stitched them together and created a never-ending line of Coventry citizens dancing anonymously with one another, which we then projection mapped back on the city in a variety of different places. And the final one was what's called the buddy bench, which is a bench where if you sit down next to a stranger and start talking, you both get a massage. And it was kind of in response to that idea of you walking around with your sandwiches at lunchtime on a nice sunny day, and every single bench has got one person sitting on it, and because we're British, we can't sit down next to them. Even if there's butt room for 3 other people on the bench, you still wouldn't sit down next to them. So these things that we're creating, they're about tackling and driving dialogue around things like our ownership of public space, our relationship with our neighbours, the degree to which we feel comfortable owning our city, the nudge behaviour with which small changes can be made. Now, we hit about 190,000 people with this project, but we never ever talk about that number. In fact, it went on one Arts Council report because they very specifically asked us to count something. But the number that I think is much more important is the active participatory number. So we worked with more than 6,500 members of this city's community to drive these discussions. We were never attempting to create a solution, instead to drive the discussion, because it's through critical engagement with these subject matters that hopefully the more dynamic and more important results kind of come. And that's everything I wanted to tell you about Open Citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.